Chapter 8. An Angry Elephant. "We'll help you find your poodles," said Pam kindly to the excited young woman. But the girl wondered, if they had been stolen, just how the Hollisters would do this. "Are you sure someone took your dogs?" she asked. The woman, whose name was Mrs. Blake, said that after the dog warden had left, she'd tied the white poodles in back of the cottage, as she often did. "They never tried to run away," she said, "so I'm terribly afraid they've been stolen." Ricky looked at his brother and sister. "There, that proves I was right. The man was the Shoreham dog napper, and he took the poodles." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Blake asked. Ricky told the story, and Pam added, "We know how you feel, Mrs. Blake. We lost our collie not long ago, but we found him. I hope you'll find your dog soon." "They are such wonderful pets," the woman said, almost in tears. "Besides, they're prize winners. Fifi has taken the blue ribbon twice for best of breed in shows, and Mimi can do any number of tricks. Oh, what shall I do?" Pete offered to get in touch with the police, and Mrs. Blake said, "Oh, would you? The phone's right inside the door." The boy dashed inside the cottage. While he was calling headquarters in the town, the woman asked the other children numerous questions. She was particularly interested in hearing that they thought the man who had called on her was not really a dog warden. "We think he wrote the paper himself," Holly told her. "You know what?" said Ricky. "The poodle he stole in Shoreham was a trick dog, and Mimi can do tricks. Maybe that's what the man steals, trick dogs." Pam looked at her brother admiringly. "Rick, that's a wonderful clue." "I'll tell it to the police when they get here," Ricky said proudly. When Pete came out, he asked if the officers would arrive soon. "A policeman will be here in 10 minutes, Pete replied. While waiting for him, the children went on a hunt for clues to the dog napper. In the backyard, Ricky found a man's wide footprints, and Pete a baked-right dog biscuit. Mrs. Blake said her poodles never ate this brand, so a stranger must have dropped the biscuit after coaxing the dogs to him with it. "You're grand detectives," she complimented the children. "We're the HSSC, Ricky told her, and explained the meaning of the initials. "Oh, here comes the policeman," he announced. The officer stopped his car and walked up to the cottage. "I understand your 2 dogs have been stolen, madam," he said. "I think so," Mrs. Blake answered. "I can't find them anywhere. Officer, tell me, do you have a dog warden in this township?" The policeman pushed back his cap and said slowly, "No, not at the moment. Why?" "I believe these children can answer your question better than I can," the woman said. As the officer listened in amazement, the 4 young members of the HSSC told all they suspected about the man who had come to the Blake cottage. "He has 2 names," said Pete, "Fred Smith and Frank Shaw." The policeman nodded. "He probably uses a new one every place he goes. We'll send out an alarm for him right away." Ricky ran to get the handbill of the Wizard Circus, which he had found in the plane. The officer said he'd never heard of that particular circus. "But it doesn't mean there isn't one with that name," he added. "There are lots of circuses in Florida, and this may be a good way to trace the thief." He thanked the children for their help and then went off in his car. The next moment, Mr. and Mrs. Hollister and Sue walked up, asking what had delayed the youngsters. It was too late now to go over to the island until after lunch. Pam introduced her parents to Mrs. Blake. Then Holly said, "The HSSC has been practicing." Upon hearing the story, Mr. and Mrs. Hollister were amazed at this latest turn of events, and said they were glad their children had been of service to Mrs. Blake. "Let's hope the police catch up with that man soon," Mr. Hollister remarked. "He seems to be doing a thriving business." The family ate lunch in the attractive outdoor dining room, and at 2 o'clock set off for Circus Island. It was a long walk across the causeway, and the Hollisters stopped several times to admire the landscape. Looking toward the inlet, they saw white sails standing up against the sapphire blue of the sky. Ahead was emerald green grass and white sand of the island. "What a picture!" exclaimed Mrs. Hollister. Sue sniffed the clear, fragrant air and said, "Mommy, it smells like your bestest perfume." When they reached the end of the bridge, the Hollisters found a high wooden gate barring their path. A man who was on guard asked why they'd come. "I'm here to see Peppo, the clown," Mr. Hollister told him. "He's expecting me." The man stepped into the tiny guardhouse, picked up a phone, and after dialing, spoke a few words into the receiver. Hanging up, he returned to the Hollisters and said, smiling, "Come in." He opened the gate and pointed to the largest of several red and white striped circus tents some distance ahead. "You'll find Peppo in there," the guard said. "He's probably rehearsing." The Hollisters thanked him and hurried across the open space. Walking into the tent, they noticed several men at work raking sawdust over the earth floor. To one side, a tall clown was putting a large black French poodle through some tricks. The animal had a white paper ruff around its neck. "What a gorgeous dog," said Pam. Peppo saw the visitors approaching and stopped the act. The clown was wearing a funny, pointed hat. His costume was pure white, with big red pom-poms in a row running up the front. On his feet were extra-large red shoes, which flopped as he walked to greet the Hollisters. The clown's snow-white face had bright red dots on the cheeks and a funny round nose made of red putty. He wore a continual grin, which made the children giggle. They knew that the grin was only painted on, but they were sure he was nice, even though Hook Mertine said he was mean. "You're Mr. Hollister of Shoreham," said the clown, "right?" "Right," affirmed Mr. Hollister, and introduced his family. "Don't let us interrupt you," he insisted. "We're in no hurry." "Then my dog and I will give you a little show," Peppo offered. "Josie and I dress up every afternoon and rehearse. She works better if I'm in costume." Peppo snapped his fingers at the black poodle, who was greeting the visitors with polite wags of her pom-pom tail. "Here, Josie," the clown said, explaining that her real name was Josephine. The smart animal trotted over and obediently climbed a brightly painted ladder. Reaching the top, Josie balanced on her 2 front feet, her unusually clipped back legs high in the air. Then Peppo tossed a ball, which she caught in her mouth. With a shake of her head, she tossed it back to her owner. The Hollisters clapped with enthusiasm. Josie came down the ladder, made a great leap, and burst through a hoop of rose-colored paper which Peppo held high above her. The visitors applauded again. "She's the keenest trick dog I've ever seen," Pete remarked in wonder. "I couldn't leap through a hoop that easy." "I bet I could," Ricky boasted. Peppo looked over at the boy and motioned for him to come forward. "Try it," he invited. "Josie will be glad to rest a moment." Ricky had spoken up quickly. Now he was embarrassed, but his brother dared the boy to make the leap. Ricky walked over and stood beside Peppo. "Take your time," the clown advised. "Look at the hoop carefully and gauge the distance. Then start from back there and make a running jump." Peppo's eyes twinkled as he held the hoop aloft. After pacing backward about 5 feet, Ricky looked steadily at the torn paper hoop. He measured the height with his eyes. Then, with a few running leaps and a mighty spring, he flew through the air. Crash! Legs, arms, and rose-colored strips of paper all went down together in the sawdust. "Oh!" cried Sue. "Ricky spilled it!" Ricky was not hurt, but he would not try the stunt again. As Josie came up to lick his hand in sympathy, Peppo said, "I guess this is a trick just for 4-footed creatures." Ricky rubbed his shoulder ruefully and grinned. "Josie made it look too easy," he said. "She's a wonderful dog." Peppo leaned down to pet her. With a note of sadness in his voice, which sounded odd coming from behind the painted smile, he said, "Yes, Josie is a fine dog, but not so good as she had a partner. Since Nappy left, my act isn't worth much." "Who's Nappy?" Holly inquired. "Napoleon," the clown replied. "Josephine's partner. He disappeared mysteriously." "You mean he was stolen?" Pam asked. Peppo shrugged. "Who knows?" Pete whispered in Pam's ear. "Do you suppose Nappy was stolen by the dog napper?" "Maybe," his sister said softly. "But let's not tell Peppo yet. He seems so sad. When the police find the thief, we can see if he has Nappy too." "Right." Josie made several more jumps through the hoop. Peppo held it higher each time, but she did not miss once. "I wish she was mine," Holly said. "Couldn't we have fun with her?" "We sure could," said Ricky. "Maybe we can borrow Josie sometime." Peppo spoke up just then. "Would you like to see my houseboat now, while I take off my costume and makeup? I can give you directions." Mr. Hollister said they would rather wait and have him show it to them. "Very good," the clown said pleasantly. "There are chairs outside my dressing room where you can sit and enjoy the scenes backstage in our circus." They followed him among the tents. On the way, they met a man with balloons. He wore a floppy-brimmed hat over his wavy black hair, and the children were fascinated by his bushy handlebar mustache. Peppo stopped and asked for a large red balloon. "Thank you, Greco," Peppo said to the balloon man. "This is for a lovely little girl." With a deep bow, he presented it to Sue. "Oh, thank you," she squealed. Sue was enchanted with the balloon. She strutted along beside the others, giving her new toy the full length of its string. The Hollisters and Peppo said goodbye to Greco and continued on their way. Outside the clown's tent were benches and several chairs. Parents and children sat down to wait for Peppo. But in a few moments, Holly sprang up. "I'm a trapeze performer," she giggled, holding her arms over her head and swaying back and forth. "Don't be flopsy-dopsy again," Ricky warned her. Ugh, Holly winced at the remembrance. Presently, Peppo appeared in the doorway of his tent, dressed in street clothes, and all the paint on his face was gone. The Hollisters were startled to see how very sad his expression was. He gazed about and asked, "Where's my lovely little balloon girl?" Sue had been standing beside her father's chair a moment before, but had apparently slipped away unnoticed. "There she is," Pete said, pointing to where the red balloon was bobbing down the aisle between the tents. Sue was strolling along, stopping to peer into the open flaps of some of the tents. Mrs. Hollister spoke in a low voice to Pam. "Run and bring her back, dear. I don't think Sue should walk around here alone." As Pam set off to do as her mother asked, Peppo remarked, "Sue's pretty close to the elephants down there. She shouldn't get too near them in case they're being exercised." No sooner were the words spoken than a group of elephants suddenly appeared around the corner of a tent. A tall, heavy-set man was prodding and striking at the lead animal, but the trainer seemed to have no control over it. Pam was running now, and Mr. Hollister close behind. Sue, with no idea of the danger, stood still, waving her balloon. The elephant man did not see her. All at once, Sue's red balloon caught the eye of the lead elephant. He reared, trumpeting angrily, and headed for the little girl. "Oh!" Pam shrieked. "He'll step on Sue!"